Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist depression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Yes, that's right. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1. It's your local community radio station. My name's Andy, and I will be hanging out with you on the airwaves for the next hour. I'm coming to you this week from Banjima country in northwestern Australia, Pilbara region. I'll tell you what, there is some pretty spectacular country in this part of the world, and acknowledging traditional owners here, and of course the Jagera and Turrbal people in Brisbane, where this is being broadcast. I have been trekking around Western Australia for the last couple of months, and while I was in Perth, I happened to sit down for a chat with a friend of mine, Ray Grenfell. Now, Ray has been part of making radical community radio for a long time on the Indie Media Show on RTR-FM, and we share content sometimes, and I did hear one of the Indie Media announcers talk about Paradigm Shift as a sister show to Indie Media, and I'm happy to take that label. Both RTR is a great station and Indie Media is a great show. But Ray doesn't just host a community radio show. He is studying a PhD in how social media affects social movements, particularly radical anarchist social movements around the world and in Australia. He's done a lot of study in Indonesia in particular. And he's also somebody who is interested in creating radical social centers. Part of his study is about the praxis of creating these kind of anarchist social centers, and he is in the process of trying to pull one together in Fremantle. And so it was great to sit down and talk with Ray. We had a nice long chat, which you will get to eavesdrop on over the next hour, because I share a lot of those interests as well, and I think it's really worthwhile to unpack, the moment that we're in politically and socially, and what are the factors that influence it. How does social media play a role in this? Is this good or bad? What can we do? And so I think it's good to have an in-depth conversation, but also good, I enjoyed it a lot because me and Ray were similar ages. We come from similar sort of politics, and I guess we've seen changes in radical politics, and it's nice to sort of sit down and talk about some of these things as well. And so it's a long and winding chat. We cover a lot of ground, but basically a bit of the history of how activist groups have used the internet, a bit of how social media has changed that in recent years, or platform capitalism as another title for it, and then a bit of how some of the practices that we think can help us to deal with this and help us make sure that our movements are resisting oppression and exploitation in all its forms, and not playing into the hands of big tech, who have so adeptly co-opted so many parts of human communication and behavior. So anyway, that is what's coming up. Stick around and let's get into it.
My name is Raymond Grenfell. I present and produce the Indie Media Show in Perth, and I've been involved in a bunch of, I guess, activist things over the years. and I'm currently a PhD candidate at Curtin, looking at the impacts of platform capitalism on autonomous communities.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting topic and one that probably isn't studied very much. So, I mean, let's expand a bit on your PhD topic. Do you want to tell us, I mean, how you got into it, what kind of things you're covering?
So ostensibly, because of the last more than 20 years, I've been involved with indie media, and primarily, a bit like yourself, Andy, I've been a bit of a media activist, a term that I never used to like, but I guess I'm slowly warming to. But I've always been interested in, like, I guess, the role of citizen journalism, media activism, and its relationship to social movements. So initially, I did my master's project on looking at, like, the history of indie media and open publishing, and I guess looking at, like, how our relationship as activists in social movements, how our relationship to both, I guess, media, corporate media, but also to online media, how it's changed and transformed. And then my PhD project really kind of evolved out of that as I started investigating, I guess, platform capitalism or surveillance capitalism. I guess I've always been quite cynical and, suspicious of online activism and of corporate social media, and the role it's playing not just in social movements but in our lives, and how much it's come to mediate our social relationships. So I guess it's come from a place of, I guess, wanting to investigate how these platforms and tools impact us, and perhaps how we can better navigate them.
Well, I'm with you on that one as somebody who's, quite critical of social media, and that's right, platform capitalism is a good way of talking about it, because it's not the social that's the problem, or the media, it's the control of it. But before we get into that, indie media, I guess these days a lot of people involved in activism have no recollection of indie media.
Yeah.
So do you want to tell us what it was?
Yeah, I think it's a good starting point, because, and I think you have to. It has to all be prefaced with an understanding of the role of media in terms of society, and in terms of sort of ideas of social progression, for the more, like, liberal theorists. And I think this idea that the media in the 1990s and so forth, and even today, we live in a world of kind of corporate monopolies, and that's but initially the printing press and media was kind of heralded as a tool of democratization. So if you go back to the initial sort of proliferation of the printing press, then I guess you see that it was really, for many people, a positive thing. Like, suddenly, knowledge became more accessible, and the ability to create knowledge became more accessible. And so, ideologically, it was a very useful tool to have a printing press and to have access to media. But yeah, if you fast forward to sort of the 80s and 90s, we had, that media and print media, television media, radio media, broadcast media in general. It's very much centralized and controlled by monopolies and the corporates, who, of course, perpetuate the same ideologies of those in power. So indie media is sort of, born in that context of this sort of, complete corporate control of the media. Along comes the internet. For a lot of people at the time, and we're talking in sort of the late 1990s, the internet was seen to be another kind of force or wave of democratization. Or suddenly people had access to this tool where they could get information, and it's meant to bring about this this wave of sort of democracy, and therefore help all these social movements. And so indie media itself was born during the Seattle demonstrations in 1999 against the WTO. And that's at a time, we can get into it, but that's at a time of, like, I guess, the height of, like, the alter globalization, or, as some people call it, or the anti-globalization movements. So a whole bunch of activists involved in workers' rights, women's rights, indigenous rights, converged in Seattle to demonstrate against the WTO. And activists, primarily anarchists and hackers and journalists, sick of the fact that this corporate control of media and the control of the narrative around activism, and particularly more radical politics, sick of all that, sick of the way they're portrayed at demonstrations, decided well, look, we should develop some tools using the internet to be able to, I guess, tell our own stories. And so, with the assistance of people like, Predator from the Catalyst Collective and others in Australia who happen to be over there, they developed the first indie media website. Was an open publishing website. And so this is all prior to Web 2.0, so there was no such thing as blogs or social media. So the internet, as anyone who's old enough might remember, was a very static thing. You could build websites to some extent, but there was no ability for people to really engage or participate online. And so indie media, similar to Wikipedia that popped up at the same time, they were some of the first websites to utilize this concept of open publishing, where anyone could come along and comment, but also the code and the actual infrastructure was built and controlled by the people in indie media, the people that used it. So they built the first indie media website for Seattle, and it was a huge success, receiving nearly a million hits every day during the demonstrations. In fact, the corporate media were like constantly relying on indie media for the stories. So it was a big success. And after Seattle, indie media just kind of took off from there and expanded first, of course, through the United States, but then internationally, to the point where I think there was over 300 independent media centers around the world, all of them with their own online open publishing website, but then also other projects like video projects and print projects and radio projects and so forth. So hopefully that explains the birth of indie media.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting because I spend a lot of time thinking about, how can we use the good things of social media, that democratization, the ability to share information, share campaigns and what's going on, connecting people without just this weird intrusion into people's lives. It's weird, the domination of the algorithm, as it's called. And what I come around to is a model that looks something like indie media, where people can submit things as a kind of collective that runs it and whatever, and it's our way of sharing information. But then it's like, that already existed, and it totally got killed off by social media. Virtually as soon as social media started, indie media started to die, hey?
Yeah, totally. And it's complex. I mean, I guess firstly, I think it's, it's significant to talk about the differences between, say, like indie media, Wikipedia, these like earlier projects, some of them obviously that are still ongoing, and social media. They're very, very different in the sense that indie media, and you said it before, they were collectives. While indie media was an online phenomenon, it was based in physical organizing, and it was also the people involved were primarily interested not only in creating a platform for citizen journalism and activist media, but they were interested in creating, what's considered to be sort of counter-hegemonic institutions. So the collectives that run independent media centers, they're like more of a focus on direct democracy or consensus or, autonomy and autonomous politics. And as much as it was about people contributing online and publishing and commenting and so forth, it was often really based around the independent media centers. And these centers themselves, historically have always been, as important, I guess, as the online website to a large extent. So much so that, as some listeners may recall, the demonstrations in Genoa a year after Seattle, the independent media center there was brutally raided by the police. I mean, there was films and documentaries about it where there was so much a threat in Genoa, the independent media activists, that the police raided them, nearly killed, a few people, ended up imprisoning a bunch of activists who were then disappeared and spent, a long periods in time in incarceration, being tortured and so forth. So, the spaces, and not only at times of convergences like Seattle or Genoa, or I guess here we had S11 in Melbourne around this period of history, but those spaces, were almost sort of social centers in themselves, and they were really important in terms of bringing people together. If you went to a new city, thinking about when I was first getting involved in activism in the early 2000s, you go to a new city, you'd often try and find where the indie media space was, it might be a part of another activist collective or space, and you'd go there, and that would be your kind of in to find out what things are happening, and you could often find out about that via the website or via the space, but the two things were so interconnected. There wasn't really any independent media centers around the world that didn't have a physical presence and a physical collective. They're all collectively run. In comparison to that, what we have of platform capitalism or corporate social media and the sort of the interconnected network of platforms is we're all atomized individuals engaging with this sort of Starbucks-like corporate platform. And so it's a totally different experience. You're just an individual on there arguing with other individuals in this kind of spectacle of online kind of noise. And there's no physicality to it. There's no real relationship. So I think it's a totally different thing. But yeah, I think, like how and why indie media disappeared is, interconnected with the whole nature of political development through the, 2000s. But I guess one explanation perhaps is like the technology and the fact that indie media didn't really keep up with Web 2.0. The websites, some people sort of argue now the websites became kind of clunky and difficult to use. But I personally think it's more sociological. I think it's more just the fact that we've seen just social movements kind of die off. We've also seen really the victory of neoliberalism and hyper-individualized, atomized lives take over from collective struggle. And that's reflected even in social movements themselves. At the time of the early 2000s, there was this real idea of the multitude, as some people refer to it. Like different people coming together for one common cause. Now our campaign groups and our social movements are all much more focused on just individual issues. But yeah, there's a lot there to unpack. But I think it's not as simple as to say that indie media wasn't technologically as savvy as the new stuff that happened with Web 2.0. Or just didn't keep up. I think it's also just reflective more broadly of our changing social reality.
Yeah, it's a interesting topic, but one totally for another time about what happened to the alter globalization movement, and because it was such a inspiring kind of politics that sort of seemed to come to an end, replaced by a much more individualized kind of politics. But anyway, we'll leave that. I think one of the things that's interesting about what you're studying is, maybe not as much as there should be, but there is some study about how social media affects individuals and large communities. A lot of talk about the divisions in society and things like that. But the counterculture, as we once knew it, has also been very much swallowed up into social media. And so many things, even like I'm here in Perth in a new city, and it's like, what happened to the street press? Remember, you get a street press, find out what's happening. And these institutions of alternative culture that existed that have sort of been swallowed up into this mega capitalist, biggest corporations in the world. That's a really interesting thing to study, especially for those of us interested in creating a better world.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess, because my research more specifically looks at autonomous or activist communities, but I also play in bands and I'm kind of involved in those kind of scenes, so you see that impact. But I think it's happened so quickly that none of us really realize how significant it is. And I think one of the real sort of telling aspects of that is just it doesn't seem that long ago, like even 10 years ago, that I would go to gigs, for instance, and just hand out flyers, and you'd build those sort of relationships with people, and you'd it was all, again, there's a physicality to your community. And now everything, like when you put on a gig, it's just a Facebook event, or, maybe you put up a sponsored post on Instagram or something. But I think all of us, maybe we're subconsciously aware of it, but we're not entirely aware of how much these platforms are mediating our lives. And then with that, there comes the sort of, the changing economic reality that has occurred, sort of surreptitiously. The fact that data is now the largest commodity in the world, and the big tech companies are they're the oil barons and they're the rubber barons of the 21st century, and just how influential and significant and important those companies are, and how much control and power they have. But I think it's kind of terrifying, just because everyone I think is aware of just how nuts it is. Just that example of two people sitting in a room chatting to each other on their phone, basically. It's just sort of common now, and just even how the effects it's had on our language and our psychology and culture and counterculture as well, because now everything is just on a platform, and like you go to a show and people are just filming things, and it's almost our whole relationship with reality is changing. Our relationship to meaning is changing. Previously and historically, the role of media is typically more it's a reflection, like any art, it's a reflection of culture to some extent, and it's a feedback loop. So films will be released, and then we sort of reference them and so forth. But I think now, like, actually, you have this phenomenon now where things happen in real life, and we're reminded of things we've consumed via screens. And I think, it seems really stupid and whatever, but like, it happens all the time. Like, people will be having a normal conversation, and they'll be like, "Oh, that's just like in that TV series, or on that video, or on that thing I saw on TikTok, or whatever." So, if our understanding of media was driven primarily by our physical experience in the world, if that's changed, that has a lot of significance. Even if it hasn't totally flipped, but if now our lived experience is being largely determined by our experiences on screens, well, that it's quite terrifying in a way, and it has certain ramifications, both psychological, political, social ramifications.
It's very Guy Debord, Society of the Spectacle. All it was once directly experienced becomes mediated. But then you think, well, that text was actually written in the 50s, right? And it's like, and so this process has been going on, for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, and following from Debord, people like Baudrillard wrote about this of simulacra and simulation, and I don't think even Baudrillard could envisage what we have today, because it is like a Baudrillardian nightmare in that sense that now the things we experience in real life are very much just replications of things we've experienced via screens. And I think, I don't know, like, a lot of people say, well, so what, like, reality is subjective anyway, like, what does it matter? But I think the main issue of all of this is that there are certain parameters to platforms, and there's a certain logic to those platforms, and it's a neoliberal capitalist logic. So, there's a reality to the physicality of it. It's a screen, it's a flattened 2D experience, so it doesn't matter what it is if it's just text and images. There's a sort of process in which everything becomes flattened. So the mediocre becomes important, the important becomes mediocre, because your physical experience of it is just text and images. So that's one element of it. But there's also the sort of the economic and social logic of these platforms that are all for-profit platforms that are all showing you things to encourage you to spend more time on them, to buy things, to interact with certain people. All these platforms have admitted that they do, impact, and manipulate the algorithms to make you see what you want to see. There's so many, and these are even just it's common knowledge now that people know that you talk around your phone and then the advertisement comes up, or, you're talking about a person and you see more of that person. And so, our phones are constantly listening to us, constantly monitoring us. There's all the issues of surveillance, control, what's particularly relevant for, I guess, people involved in social movements or for activists. But yeah, I think it's the complexities and the problems around it are so much that I think it's kind of hard for us to grasp, and hard for us to even understand what's happening and what impact it's having, not just on us sociality, but also on our psychology as well.
Yeah, and I think to bring it back again to radical politics, which is about expressing possibilities, right, and trying to convince people of future possibilities that are different to our current lived reality. And in the physical world, in a world of physical interactions, you're bound by physical laws, right, that govern us. And there's other things, that dictate our behavior, but it's sort of limited in that way. And in a way, online communication, you're not limited by physical realities, either in distance to communicate or speed to communicate, or even in notions of identity. Like, people take on these online identities beyond like what your physical reality is, and that's changes. And so in a way you can think, oh, you're more free, except now you're bound by, these rules dictated by the people who made the platform, and no longer do we even know what the physical laws are that are governing us. We're bound by these kind of secret laws put down by people who are profiting off the whole thing.
Those differences in terms of, physical space and online space are really significant and important. And I think, if anything, that's what people should really be thinking about, because you're right, like, there is this illusion that you can be and do whatever you want online, but it's not real, and it's also within those parameters. I'm still engaging in this corporate platform that's ultimately just profiting off my, my use of it. And where's the meaning, where's the significant relationship? And it's just it's a big sort of virtual reality in which I'm still just sitting in my room in Hamilton Hill. Like and I think the other significant thing is, and we've seen this with like the real renewed interest in like far right ideas and the alt right, and I think it's not a surprise that those kind of ideologies of sort of ethnic nationalism and neo-Nazism and so forth, that they thrive in the online world because of the parameters of platform capitalism are hyper individualized and atomized. You can be and do and say whatever you want without any responsibility or accountability or consequence. There's no need to really collectively work together with anyone. And you can have a lot of, I guess, impact in terms of, as much impact as any online reality is or has, just as an individual. Even the tendency towards conspiracy and there's this reality in platform capitalism that all opinions are equal in a way, so anyone can say anything. It's not based in historical material reality or fact. Like anyone can comment on anything, and it's like, well, that's their opinion, and that's what matters. And it's like, well, that's not what actually shapes political history. And that we live in a material world still, and not all opinions matter. Like, in fact, I don't think opinions matter at all, to be perfectly honest. But I'm a very hardline materialist in that sense. But like in the online world, that is the reality, and so therefore these hyper individualistic, bigoted ideologies thrive because it's almost like designed for them in a way, because that's what they can gain. And also, the more controversial you are, the more viral whatever you say or do becomes, and so it's very much geared to that. Whereas I think, again, I'm quite a sort of traditional materialist, but I think that the left has always thrived in physical space and physical institutions, because that's where you have to work together with people, and regardless of their background, regardless of their sex or their race or their gender or their age, or it's the idea of like a politics of commonality, and that like, oh look, let's build this this project together, whether it's a social center or a campaign, or exchanging sort of solidarity with one another and communities. I think there's something very human about that, and that's what the left has traditionally, I guess, tried to encourage and inspire in people.
Yeah, I have my own kind of thoughts about the way people talk about leftist politics, or progressive politics as it's commonly referred to now. That's also changing, and that this is related somewhat, I guess, to our becoming more data selves than physical selves, in that so it becomes more individualized and less focused on material realities, and so you get these political issues that are about representation in media, that are about the words we use, that and notions of identity, the validity of identity and things like that, and that these become big focuses, while a lot of the material realities and the material gains that have been won are sort of chipped away. And of course, climate change is a ultimate material threat, and yet so much of what would be described as leftist politics is just about these really theoretical ideas, and I think that has a lot to do with our disembodied selves in online communication.
Yeah, I think disembodiment is such a good way of putting it. I remember interviewing someone about this not that long ago, who was talking about embodiment as the sort of a left-wing principle, or a radical left-wing principle, and that like when you're embodied in yourself and in your community, you're more inspired to work collectively with people, and then the more you become atomized from yourself, whether that's through wage labor, what's fundamentally an alienating process, or through consumption, or now through new media, the more you become disembodied, the more you lose touch with community, with your humanity, in a sense. And it's funny because it's almost sort of ontologically sort of like a spiritual thing, arcs back to that idea of sort of embodiment. But yeah, I used to think, I guess, that it was perhaps just a phenomenon of affluence, or privilege to some extent. But I mean, a lot of my research has been done in places like Yogyakarta and in these sort of DIY art collectives, and Indonesia, for instance, is one of the largest users of social media in the world. They've got more WhatsApp users than anywhere else. And yeah, unfortunately, the things that we're experiencing are very much still experienced in places, because you kind of, I guess it's like a, sort of anarchist or whatever, I sort of hope like, oh, maybe there's still parts of the world where like people don't have as much time on their hands, they're not as affluent, and maybe they're still working together and they're not just all chatting to each other on WhatsApp and Facebook. But unfortunately, my experience is not, it's not the case. But I do, I don't know, you kind of hope that people get a level of fatigue at some point as well. But I think we're not even conscious of what happens to us when we're on these platforms, and what happens to us in terms of the disembodiment. And like you said, like it becomes an absurdity. It becomes an absurdity in terms of what we focus on. I mean, we saw that with these really important movements, such as like the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, that when it took off here in Australia. That there's so much racial injustice in Australia, particularly when it comes to our First Nations people, but so much of that gets lost. That we should be really sort of pushing for campaigns around ending deaths in custody and closing the gap in I think like abolishing native title and actually introducing forms of proper sovereignty and self-determination and these. But like a lot of it always comes back to like, oh, we just need more Indigenous people on TV or more Indigenous people in Parliament, or like it's just not a material change. And I don't think fundamentally, even if people get excited about when they see it, like it doesn't actually change their lives. It's like when a couple of friends would always joke when Obama was elected and ended up using more drones and bombing more people than even Bush did. And you think, well, like I'm sure the people in Iraq and Afghanistan were like happy that the president sending the bombs to blow up their villages was a person of color. I mean, it's just it's a joke, like it's the largest empire in the world, and people are celebrating that he's a person. It's just, but I think that is so much tied into surveillance capitalism, platform capitalism, and what we consider to be important now, because we live these very disembodied representational lives, and we're not so grounded in our actual physical communities. We're not really working with our neighbors or our, in our local groups, and a lot of the civic spaces that traditionally were like these hubs of sort of progressive or left-wing politics, a lot of them have just disappeared, and the vacuum has been filled by platform capitalism.
I guess that process continues with the metaverse, and it's bizarre. The metaverse is so obviously in the interests of big tech. It's a universe that they control, and it's hard to. I don't know that people even really want a metaverse, but the media hype around it is relentless, and it seems inevitable that this thing that we're going to be forced into the metaverse just because of the power of these corporations.
Yeah, it's kind of scary, isn't it? It's you often think. I mean, and again, it's ironic because I'm very much a product of this reality as well. So when this stuff happens, you kind of think of like the Tyrell Corporation in Blade Runner, and it's and again, it's almost proving my point that it's like these things, this insane, like these insane corporations that have so much control, and that are basically mediating our lives and every aspect of our lives, from like how we date people to the food we consume to how we go everywhere, it's all in like how we communicate and how we organize ourselves. It's all, slowly being, controlled and owned by these few corporations. And yet then you just think, oh, it's just like the Tyrell Corporation in Blade Runner, or that's just like it's and that sort of proves the point. And and then it becomes less real in a strange way. But I don't know. I don't know if there's a growing awareness around it. It's a bit like I mean, different to the metaverse stuff, but it's a bit like I think the influence and control like corporations like Monsanto have. And it's just it doesn't get talked about. But again, I wonder to what extent it doesn't get talked about because we're also preoccupied with being on these platforms, and I think just like I guess going back because we haven't really talked about some of the potential like really serious outside of the more abstract psychological, social ramifications of these platforms, the real like immediate impacts on social movements and activists. And I think, one of the important things to look at is, like Arab Spring and some of these movements that were some of the first to use these platforms in their organizing. And there were a lot of like Western commentators at the time that sort of almost perpetuated quite a kind of like a colonial Eurocentric myth by saying that like these platforms kind of aided or even brought freedom to these places, like in Egypt or elsewhere during the Arab Spring. But that if people actually followed up what happened, a lot of these governments then people were using Facebook and Twitter and so forth to organize, and then the regimes would just be turning to these platforms for all the contact information and networks and arresting people, and then just using them as these tools of surveillance and control. Historically, the secret police and the state would have to torture activists for the kind of information we now willingly give them on a daily basis and hand them on a silver platter. You almost we're putting the secret police out of work, really, because we're basically doing their job for them.
We've talked a lot about, I guess, online discourse and culture and things like that, but the other side of both your PhD study and your political praxis is talking about radical social centres, and there's something you're trying to start one here in Fremantle. And I guess what's the virtue of a radical social centre in a world of online dominated community?
So I think again, I'm a materialist. I think it's important to create physical infrastructure and spaces, and I guess I come from like politically a tradition of valuing and believing in the creation of prefigurative institutions. And to briefly explain what that means, is essentially, I guess, there's largely a shift in the late 20th century away from the idea that we just need to overthrow the state and then everything will be great. We'll have a social revolution. There'll be a communist utopia and so forth. And there was a shift towards I guess what people call sort of post-leftist or post-Marxist thinking, where there was this idea of creating institutions that embody the principles and beliefs and values that we would like to see in an alternate society. So rather than waiting for that one glorious revolutionary moment where everyone's suddenly free and liberated, that we start to create these things now. But it's not. It's actually these politics arc back even further. So you can look at, for instance, into what's referred to as the Summer of Anarchy in parts of Spain, predominantly around Barcelona, in 1936 and 37, I believe, for that period of time where there was some 3 million anarchists that created these participatory direct democracy spaces where they worked together and cultivating the land, and also in fighting the fascists and dealing with the Republicans and the Stalinists. But I think it's really important for us in our own lives, and if people with radical politics, to actually have spaces and microcosms in which we can experiment with participatory forms of governance and mutual aid and solidarity. And historically, we don't have it so much in Australia, but that's what social centres have been. So you have the whole occupied social centre movement in Europe, and the autonomous movements that came out of the sort of squatter movements in Amsterdam and elsewhere in the sort of 70s through the 2000s, where people would occupy places and set up these intentional communities and these, run schools and English classes and soup kitchens and, shelter and lots of, I guess, sort of social projects, but all collectively organised and with a focus on, this sort of mutual aid and direct democracy and so forth. So I think it's really important. And I mean, you don't want to overstate the importance, but I think in terms of looking at a potential antidote to the alienation and atomization and spectacle of online platforms, I think, collaborative physical institutions like social centres might offer some alternative, because it gives us an opportunity to not only be more embodied in ourselves and in our community, but actually to really physically work with people in creating, more free and democratic, inclusive structures and spaces.
Mm. Yeah, and it's putting those politics into practice, in physical communities that
Yeah.
are measurable by the people there, but also in spaces, that do embody these beliefs. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and it's I mean, it's not. I think a lot of us, if you have radical politics, you have this idea, well, we're never going to see a social revolution, especially if the older you get and the more cynical you get and the more insane things become, especially like with the dominance of these kind of like corporate hegemonies that we've been talking about. It's very hard to imagine like an actual any kind of revolutionary moment in our lifetime, but at the very least, if when creating these spaces, we can experiment and experience, even on a much smaller scale, the kinds of things we want to, that we're striving for the world. But and then also outside of that, it creates incredibly valuable infrastructure for campaigns and for sort of, I guess, groups that need support, so whether they be minority group or whatever. I think it's and even going back to where we started with indie media, that was another significant thing about indie media. It wasn't just about individuals finding out information, sharing information. It's about all the infrastructure that was created. It was like the list servers, that were created to support campaign groups and social movements and so forth. So I think having spaces, they're sort of twofold, and it's a space to experiment with radical politics and to engage with our community, and it's sort of healthy for us in that sense, but then also provides really necessary infrastructure for social movements, for environmental campaigns or social campaigns or economic campaigns. Have a space that's freely accessible and people can meet there, have shared resources, tool libraries, that kind of thing. So it's I think beneficial in both senses.
All right. Well, there's much more we could talk about, but I think we're out of time. Thanks very much, Ray.
No, thanks, Andy. That was great.
I hope you enjoyed the chat I had with Ray Grenfell over the show. It was interesting finishing up talking about the need for building prefigurative political spaces that kind of live out the future that we hope to see. Because 4ZZZ is one of them, and it was the hard work of people living in the middle of Joh Bjelke-Petersen's Queensland who saw the importance of independent media, but also of spaces where people could gather. And it is a space where lots of different people work together on a shared goal, which again is something that builds commonality, but also builds power, our belief in our own ability to do things. And I think that's one of the things we talk about, the alienation of social media, everybody sitting alone behind their screens, but also where your only contribution to things is your opinion, It doesn't build power, it doesn't build a sense of change in what's possible. Which is what radical politics should do, It should be things that shift our understandings of what the world can be like, that we've been given a world that looks like one thing, but it's not the only possibility. And as we get in and do the praxis of trying to build these alternative institutions, we learn different things about ourselves that we didn't know. We learn different things about our communities and what they're capable of. And all of a sudden, the world, which had seemed so monolithic and kind of overwhelming, becomes a bit more malleable, and we start to think, actually, maybe we can change a few things. And so I encourage you to get out there, get involved in groups that share your beliefs or that have projects that are worth working on. There's so many in Brisbane and all over the place. And maybe start up some of your own. Talk about your friends. What can we do? What do we need to do? And maybe also talk about, hey, how do these social media platforms affect us? As we've said today, it just doesn't get talked about very much, and we live it every single day. The reality of life in techno-capitalism, and of course, as the technology increases, these things are going to increase more and more. So anyway, I intend to keep talking about these things on the Paradigm Shift, and we'll be back next week with more information to empower and inspire you to go out and make a better world. I'll see you next week.